if it's your first time here, welcome. This is a really good group. We're really good people, I think, or at least we're trying to be. And you'll see tonight in the discussion how careful everyone is with each other, but also critical. We don't pull any punches, I don't think, but we also speak with compassion about the subjects we're talking about tonight. Speaking of which is 9/11. So I feel like we kind of had to do this on 9/11. It's been a heavy couple of weeks. We did Medusa last week, and now we're doing 9/11. So the passage tonight comes from Jonathan Safran Foer's Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close. Yeah. Okay. Was born? Oh, really? Well, happy birthday, granddaughter. Thank you. Wow. Well, thank you for getting us off to a hopeful start. Good. All right, so here's our passage. After a time, I had only a handful of words left. Does it break my heart? Of course. Every moment of every day into more pieces than my heart was made of. I never thought of myself as quiet, much less silent. I never thought about things at all. Everything changed. The distance that wedged itself between me and my unhappiness wasn't the world. It wasn't the bombs and the burning buildings. It was me. It was my thinking. The cancer of never letting go. Is ignorance bliss? I don't know. But it's so painful to think. And tell me, what did thinking ever do for me? To what great place did thinking ever bring me? I think and think and think I've thought myself out of happiness 1,000,000 times, but never once into it. Jonathan Safran Foer, born February 21st, 1977, grandson of Holocaust survivors on his mother's side. When he was 8 years old, I'm sorry, I have a note here. When Jonathan was a child, he would visit his grandmother's house, where he would be hauled into the air for a hug. He'd be lifted up upon arriving and leaving. And only later did he realize that his grandmother had been weighing him rather than hugging him, because that's what they did in the camps to see how well their health was. They would pick you up, and if they could pick you up too easily, then you were in trouble. So you might need some extra care. And then at 8 years old, so he's got that. He's got his grandmother weighing him. I don't think he knew it at the time, but, you know, that's happening. Then he's at boarding school, and there's an accident in the chemistry lab. And he burns, there's an explosion, and he's covered in some sort of burning liquid, and he thinks his skin is coming off. He feels like his skin is coming off. And he says he had something like a nervous breakdown drawn out over about the next 3 years at 8. All right? I don't know about you, but I couldn't handle anything at 8. His brother Franklin is an editor at the New Republic. His brother Joshua is the founder of Atlas Obscura. What? We have an Atlas Obscura event coming up next month. We love Atlas Obscura. You may, if you know him at all, you probably know him by his first book, Everything is Illuminated, or the film. Anybody know this? Great book. Hailed as one of the great new writers. It's the story of a character named Jonathan Safran Foer, who goes in search of a village in Ukraine that was decimated, or almost decimated, during World War II by the Germans. And anyway, it's the story of that search. It's 2002, hailed as this great new writer. Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close comes in 2005, and that's what we're talking about tonight. And then Eating Animals is a nonfiction work, 2009. Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close got some of the most vitriolic reviews I've ever read. And these, you know, I'm not talking about Amazon reviews. I'm talking about Michiko Kakutani at the New York Times. Other famous reviewers just decimated this novel. I think they missed it. Seriously, I think they just didn't see what was happening. But maybe you'll agree that it's a bad novel. I don't. It is a 9/11 novel, and it's unique, I think. The only other time I've taught 9/11 is I was teaching a senior writing seminar at a university, and I used the 9/11 report, a government-issued report. You ever read this? It's rather amazing. It's pretty thick, and it was my assigned textbook for the class because the writing was so interesting and well done. I know, it was a government report, but it was well written. One of the striking sentences early on in the 9/11 report is that 9/11 happened because of a failure of the imagination. That's right, isn't it? Even at the most basic level, the government failed to imagine this happening in this way. But of course, I think it means a lot more than that. I think it means failure of the religious imagination, among other things. All right, let's get into it. Oscar Schell. By the way, this is a film, too, with Tom Hanks and Sandra Bullock. Max von Sydow, by the way. Anyway, Oscar Schell is a precocious 9-year-old mom. He has a mother. She's a very important character, as you'll see. But Dad, his father, Thomas Schell Jr., played by Tom Hanks in the film, is kind of the center of the story. He's not the protagonist, but he's the absent presence because he dies in the towers. And he and his son are very close. Well, you'll see. Then there's Oscar's grandfather, Grandpa. And again, this is a very dense, complicated, difficultly plotted novel, so I'm going to do my best to share it with you without you getting lost or me getting lost. But for now, let's just know that Grandpa is Oscar's grandfather, and Grandma is his mother, and Anna is her sister. Okay, now, so the passage we read was actually from Grandpa in regard to the Dresden bombing during World War II. But as you'll see here, the novel connects all kinds of bombings, all kinds of mass death by fire, with buildings coming down and landscapes and cityscapes being devastated. Hey, I was just talking about you, Ankit. Talking about your lecture. This is Dr. Shah, who's going to be talking about medical ethics. So Dresden, Hiroshima, 9/11. These are all powerful events in the novel. And that's what affected Grandpa. Grandpa was actually in love with Grandma's sister, Anna, and planned to marry her, but she died in the bombing, the Dresden bombing. And so he ends up with her sister, but he can't quite let Anna go. And so in seeing his wife, he's really seeing Anna. And he's also a sculptor, and he tries to sculpt Grandma, but it's really Anna. Yeah, so I know, it's already complicated. By the way, the film can't even, and I honestly don't think, I think there are some novels that can't be filmed, and this is one of them. So to do the film, they simply had to eliminate the Grandma and Grandpa narratives, which I would have done too if I were making the film. You simply can't have all that going on. I think The Handmaid's Tale is another unfilmable novel, which doesn't mean they didn't make a film about it. Okay. So Oscar, there's Oscar in the film. Brilliantly done. I forget the actor's name, but he did a great job. He's a brilliant 9-year-old struggling with depression following the death of his father, Thomas Shell Jr., during the attacks on the World Trade Center. They were very close. It's not clear. It seems like Oscar is on the autism spectrum, but the book never says that, so I'm a little hesitant to say it, but boy, it sure seems like it. Regardless, Oscar is fearful, very fearful of the world, and now even more so that his father's been killed in the attacks. And one of the things that troubles him greatly is, in fact, this is where the novel opens, is they're going to the funeral and they're burying an empty casket. And Oscar, he just can't process this. Why would you do that? He's not there. And this becomes a plot point, a driver of the plot in the novel. He feels more distant from his mother. He's 9. I don't know, maybe this happens a lot. But she works a lot. His father's a great storyteller and a great adventurer within their little New York apartment. And so he's always sending Oscar on these reconnaissance trips, he calls them. So he'll send him to Central Park with his metal detector and ask him to find treasures from the lost 6th borough of New York. Great fun. His father also corrects the New York Times every Sunday. So the father and son and the grandfather, they share this kind of through line of being very obsessive about information and correct information, maybe too obsessive. The day of the attacks on 9/11, Oscar comes home. He's very confused, as we all were. He comes home to his apartment. He's fine. And he hears his father calling. And he won't pick it up. And his father calls 6 times. And he says, "Are you there? Are you there?" And Oscar just stares at the phone. And he won't pick it up. This is not good for Oscar's well-being, because he knows he had a chance to talk to his father, but he was too afraid. So what he does is he goes and gets an identical answering machine, programs it. Do you know answering machines? Right? They're used. Okay, just make sure. Programs it with the same greeting, which was his, and replaces it. And he hides the old answering machine with his father's messages. Yeah. This is the opening paragraph of the novel, and I want to give you a sense of Oscar's narration here, because I think it reveals a lot about Oscar's character. And this is all about Oscar, really. So let's get a sense of what he's like. What about a tea kettle? What if the spout opened and closed when the steam came out so that it would become a mouth and it could whistle pretty melodies or do Shakespeare or just crack up with me? I could invent a tea kettle that reads in Dad's voice so I could fall asleep, or maybe a set of kettles that sings the chorus of Yellow Submarine, which is a song by the Beatles, who I love because entomology is one of my raisons d'etre, reasons for existence, which is a French expression that I know. Another good thing is that I could train my anus to talk when I farted. If I wanted to be extremely hilarious, I'd train it to say, "Wasn't me," every time I made an incredibly bad fart. And if I ever made an incredibly bad fart in the Hall of Mirrors, which is in Versailles, which is outside of Paris, which is in France, obviously my anus would say, "Ce n'était pas moi." Dad always used to tuck me in, and he'd tell the greatest stories. We'd read the New York Times together, and sometimes he'd whistle "I Am the Walrus," because that was his favorite song. Even though he couldn't explain it, what it meant, which frustrated me. One thing that was so great was how he could find a mistake in every single article we looked at. Sometimes they were grammar mistakes, sometimes they were mistakes with geography or facts, and sometimes the article just didn't tell the whole story. I loved having a dad who was smarter than the New York Times, and I loved how my cheek could feel the hairs on his chest through his t-shirt, and how he always smelled like shaving, even at the end of the day. Being with him made my brain quiet. I didn't have to invent a theme. So the book comes in not exactly chapters, but in these, I guess, sections. And the next section is Thomas Shell Sr., Oscar's grandfather, 1963. This is a letter to his son, who died, Oscar's father, describing how he moved from Germany to America and gradually lost his ability to speak. Beginning first with Anna, the woman he was in love with in Germany, and who died in the Dresden bombing. And that's the passage I read. It's from, I'm not going to read it again because I just read it, but he's lost, I had only a handful of words left, he says. And so he eventually tattoos yes and no onto the palms of his hands. And so if you ask him a question, he'll do one or the other. And he writes in these notebooks when he wants to communicate. So he keeps a notebook with him, and he'll answer you briefly, whatever will fit on a page of a notebook, and isn't yes or no. Thomas is in New York in '63 and meets Anna's sister who in a bakery, and she asked him to marry her. She asked him to marry her in 1963. And this is a complicated relationship that I really can't explain, except that it's unusual. But they have, well, he uses her as a model to sculpt her sister Anna. So there's that. And then they have to mark off their apartment in place. This actually may not be a bad idea. They mark off places that belong to Anna, they mark off places that belong to Thomas, and then they block off shared spaces, and then there's no place where no one can go. Wouldn't that be interesting? And so you never cross into each other's space. You can be in the shared space, but only together, and you can never be in the no place. So this is something about the nature of their relationship. One day, Oscar's poking around in his apartment, and he knocks over a vase in the closet. The vase shatters, and a key falls out. Actually, an envelope falls out. One of those little envelopes you might put a key in. It has the word black written on it, and a key. He decides that this is a message from his father. His father's left him a key, and he must find what the key fits, the lock that the key fits. This would not be uncommon for Thomas Shell Jr. to do this. This is the kind of reconnaissance mission he would have his son do. So Oscar thinks, okay, I know what to do now. I will interview everyone named Black in New York City. And that is his quest. That's a total of 472 people, 270 houses, because some of the blacks live together. And he is going to do this on his own. He's going to finish his final mission his father left for him. And here is Oscar's voice again. In bed that night, I invented a special drain. Notice how Oscar invents things when he's in trouble. He invents things. Yeah, we can talk more about that. In bed that night, I invented a special drain that would be underneath every pillow in New York and would connect to the reservoir. Whenever people cried themselves to sleep, the tears would all go to the same place, and in the morning, the weatherman could report if the water level of the Reservoir of Tears had gone up or down, and you would know if New York was in heavy boots. That's his phrase, heavy boots. Sad. And when something really terrible happened, like a nuclear bomb or at least a biological weapons attack, an extremely loud siren would go off, telling everyone to get to Central Park to put sandbags around the reservoir. Now, again, this may sound strange because it's hard to articulate this novel, but his grandmother writes letters to Oscar too. And this is what she does. She describes her life in Germany, moving to New York, meeting, and eventually meeting his grandfather. But she will not let Oscar know who his grandfather is. But she'll write the letter about the story. This becomes important later on. First, the first person on the list is Abby Black, played beautifully, as always, by Viola Davis in the film. So Oscar will not take public transit in New York, so he walks to Queens from, I think he's on the Upper East Side. He walks to Queens to talk to Aaron Black, and then he walks further and talks to Abby Black. When he meets Abby Black, she's having an argument with her husband in the background. He's in the background, and he's yelling, and she's crying. And Oscar says, my name is Oscar Schell, and I'm wondering if you know what this key fits. And she says, what? What? Why are you alone? What are you doing? You're 9 years old. What do you want? He's like, well, again, my father died, and he left me this key, and I want to know what it fits. And it says Black on the envelope, so I thought maybe you would know. And she was like, I don't know anything. What are you talking about? And so begins Oscar's quest. Oscar visits Grandma in this section of the novel, and he can hear her talking to the renter in the other room. And he says, who's the renter? And she says, don't ever talk to the renter. Okay. Here again is Oscar's voice. I read the first chapter of A Brief History of Time when Dad was still alive, and I got incredibly heavy boots about how relatively insignificant life is, and how compared to the universe and compared to time, it didn't even matter if I existed at all. When Dad was tucking me in that night, we were talking about the book, and I asked if he could think of a solution to the problem. Which problem? The problem of how relatively insignificant we are. He said, well, what would happen if a plane dropped you in the middle of the Sahara Desert and you picked up a single grain of sand with tweezers and moved it 1 millimeter? I said, I'd probably die of dehydration. Oscar's not dumb, and he's funny. He said, no, the father said, I mean, just right then, when you moved that single grain of sand, what would that mean? I said, I don't know what. He said, think about it. I thought about it, and I said, I guess it would mean that I've moved a grain of sand, which would mean you changed the Sahara Desert, wouldn't it? So the Sahara is a vast desert, and you changed it. Now we move again, and if you think this is fragmented, it is. It's meant to be fragmented, so I am trying to convey that. So next we move to a letter from Grandpa to his son, Oscar's father, Thomas Jr. And he talks about this division of their apartment into these spaces, the shared space, the grandpa space, the grandma space, and the nobody space. He also explains to Thomas Jr. how much he was in love with Anna in Germany. And he gives his wife a typewriter with no ribbon. Do you know what a typewriter is? I'm just checking. Okay. She can't really see very well, so he gives her a typewriter with no ribbon, but she gets to work writing, and she's just clacking away all day. And she fills the pages with nothing, but she keeps typing the pages. And Grandpa realizes he must leave her then. Oscar is in his school's production of Hamlet. Like we didn't need any more metaphors here, but okay. And he plays the silent role, of course. I think he plays Yorick, yeah. The dead guy. Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him well, right? Some of the blacks he's been meeting around New York are in the audience. And he's like, well, that's strange. And it is strange, isn't it? What are these people doing in the audience of his little private school crappy play of Hamlet? Then he meets a Mr. Black who actually lives in his building. And they become good friends, largely because Oscar turns up the man's hearing aid, which he did not realize was turned down. And so he's been kind of stumbling through life thinking the world had become silent. Again, metaphors, right? And Oscar's just like, oh, well, why don't you do this? Whoa! And so now he loves this child, thinks he's some golden child who's restored his hearing. So Mr. Black becomes great friends. He becomes his helper, really, on the journey, and helps him travel around the 5 boroughs. Oscar, again, his voice commenting on playing Yorick. I felt that night on the stage under that skull incredibly close to everything in the universe, but also extremely alone. By the way, this phrase reappears very nicely. I think it's a nice thread through the novel. Incredibly and extremely, because that's Oscar's life. Incredibly and extremely. Incredibly close to everything in the universe, but also extremely alone. I wondered, for the first time in my life, this is 9 years old, I wondered for the first time in my life if life was worth all the work it took to live. What exactly made it worth it? What's so horrible about being dead forever and not feeling anything, not even dreaming? What's so great about feeling and dreaming? Now we switch to a letter from Grandma to Oscar, where she says to Oscar that she realizes that Grandpa did not love her, and she realized she was typing blank pages. She eventually becomes pregnant and tells him, knowing that he will leave her. And when he does leave, they have lots of menagerie of pets, and she sets them all free in the city once he leaves. Oscar, for his school project, brings a survivor of Hiroshima to talk about the bomb. It does not go well, as you might imagine. A Hiroshima survivor talking about what he saw that day in 1945 to a group of school children, 9-year-olds. His mother takes him to a therapy session. That does not go well because he's clearly smarter than the therapist. And he says this, "When Mom tucked me in that night, she could tell that something was on my mind. And I asked if I wanted to talk. I did, but not to her. So I said, no offense, but no. Are you sure? Très fatigué." I'm sure I messed that up. Very tired. I said, waving my hand, "Do you want me to read something to you?" "It's okay. We could go through the New York Times and look for mistakes." She's trying to replace the father. "No, thank you." "All right," she said, "all right." She gave me a kiss and turned off the light, and then as she was about to go, I said, "Mom?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Do you promise not to bury me when I die?" She came back over and put her hand on my cheek and said, "You're not going to die." I told her I am. She said, "You're not going to die anytime soon. You have a long, long life ahead of you." I told her, "As you know, I'm extremely brave, but I can't spend eternity in a small underground place. I just can't. Do you love me?" Well, of course I love you, Oscar. Then put me in one of those mausoleum thingies. A mausoleum? Like I read about. Do we have to talk about this? Yes. Now? Yes. Why? Because what if I die tomorrow? You're not going to die tomorrow, Oscar. Dad didn't think he was going to die the next day either. That's not going to happen to you. It wasn't going to happen to him. Oscar, I'm sorry, but I just can't be buried. Do you want to be with Dad and me? Dad isn't even there. Right? This really bothers him. Excuse me? His body was destroyed. Don't talk like that, Oscar. Talk like what? It's the truth. I don't understand why everyone pretends he's there. Take it easy, Oscar. It's just an empty box. It's more than an empty box. Why would I want to spend eternity next to an empty box? Mom said his spirit is there. And that made me really angry. I told her, Dad didn't have a spirit. He had cells. His memory is there. His memory is here, I said, pointing to my head. Dad had a spirit, she said, like she was rewinding a bit in our conversation. And I told her he had cells. And now they're on rooftops and in the river and in the lungs of millions of people around New York who breathe him in every time they speak. You shouldn't say things like that. But it's the truth. Why can't I say the truth? You're getting out of control. Just because Dad died, it doesn't mean you can be illogical, Mom. Yes, it does. No, it doesn't, Mom. Get a hold of yourself, Oscar. Fuck you. Excuse me? Sorry, I mean screw you. You need a timeout. I need a mausoleum. Oscar, don't lie to me. Who's lying? Where were you? Where was I when? That day. What day? The day. What do you mean? Where were you? I was at work. Why weren't you at home? Because I have to go to work. Why didn't you pick me up from school like the other moms? Oscar, I came home as soon as I could. It takes longer for me to get home than for you to. I thought it would be better to meet you at the apartment than make you wait at school for me to get you. But you should have been home when I was home. I wish I had been, but it wasn't possible. You should have made it possible. I can't make the impossible possible, Oscar. You should have. I got home as quickly as I could, and then she started crying. And then, there's another letter from Thomas Sr. to Thomas Jr. describing the bombing of Dresden, which is incredibly horrific. And if you were to read it excerpted from the novel, you would think it was a 9/11 story, which is the whole point, is that all bombings produce mass death in the most horrific ways. And then we have the wonderful story of the sixth borough. This is magnificent, a beautiful myth that Oscar's father tells him the night before he died, actually. And I won't tell you the story, but basically there was a sixth borough, and it was connected just barely, like there were like hooks and anchors and cables and stuff to connect this borough to Manhattan. But it started drifting away, and they know it started drifting away because there used to be this annual long jump competition where you would jump over the river to the sixth borough, and the long jumpers kept missing. Like, they used to be able to do it, and then they would start landing short of the edge of this sixth borough, and so people in New York were called together, and they managed to get most of the sixth borough and put it in Central Park. But the rest of it floated away, and a lot of the people in the sixth borough just decided to float away with it. And this is Oscar again. I'm sorry, let me see who's talking here. Oh, I think this is his father, yeah. Well, it's hard for anyone, because it's a very long, involved story. And Oscar's like, Dad, really? And Dad says, well, it's hard for anyone. even the most pessimistic of pessimists, to spend more than a few minutes in Central Park without feeling that he or she is experiencing some tense in addition to the present. Some tense in addition to the present. You can feel the past. I guess, Oscar says, maybe we're just missing things we've lost, or hoping for what we want to come, or maybe it's the residue of the dreams from that night the park was moved. Maybe we miss what those children had lost and hope for what they had hoped for. Almost done, and then we'll get to the discussion. Oscar finally meets the renter. The renter, as you may have guessed by now, is Grandpa. So Grandpa has returned. She forces him to stay in his room. She won't let him talk to Oscar. In fact, she says that if he ever talks to Oscar, she'll kick him out. But as things happen, Oscar comes in one day and meets him. There's Max von Sydow playing Grandpa. Interestingly, his friend in the building, Mr. Black, now withdraws, because that's what happens in every hero's journey. The helper cannot follow you into the darkest place. The helper can only help. And so Mr. Black withdraws, and now Oscar goes into the nadir of the circle of the hero's journey, the darkest part. Oscar, again, is not smart, and he's very funny. So he figures out after not too long, that this is his grandfather. And so he tells him about the answering machine. He confesses to him that he was there when his father called on 9/11, and he refused to pick up the phone, and he hid the answering machine. And he says to Grandpa, the renter, I think we should dig up the coffin. And the renter says, okay. So he says, you can't tell your grandmother. Yeah, no shit, dude. You're digging up her son's coffin. Okay, again, there's a lot going on with Grandpa and Grandma that I really can't get into because it's too complicated. But Abby Black calls. What? Abby Black, one of the first people he meets who's having an argument with her husband. I forgot to tell you, Oscar says, he says, hello, I'm Oscar Schell, you're very pretty. And she's like, oh, hello. And he's like, may I kiss you? And she's like, what? You're 9. He's like, yeah, may I kiss you? She takes Oscar, she calls, says, I need you to come over. She takes Oscar to her former husband, the man she was arguing with, William Black, and explains that the key was left to him by his own deceased father and was accidentally sold in an estate sale. The vase was accidentally sold in an estate sale. And Oscar's father, Thomas Jr., bought it. So this story, this quest, is not what he thought it was. It wasn't even his key. It wasn't even meant for him. And this has been the orienting feature of his life, his 9-year-old life, is to find the lock that this key goes into. And it's not even his lock. It's not even his father's lock. It's William Black's lock. And interestingly, it was an estate sale of his father's home, and William Black was estranged from his father. So William Black's father left him a note saying, there's a key in the vase. I think you'll understand once you open the box, safe deposit box. So Oscar has tripped into this other story, right, and has no business being there. This is between William Black and his father, but on the other hand, William Black would have never gotten the key without Oscar's quest. Very interesting. So, the novel ends with the digging up of the grave. Oscar and the renter, Grandpa, head to the cemetery and dig up the grave. And of course, it's The coffin is empty. And the renter, Grandpa, has written, remember he's written all these letters to Thomas Jr., his son, Oscar's father, but he never sent them, or they were never sent. And so he takes the letters and puts them in the coffin. So the letters go in the coffin. Oscar returns home at 4 a.m, his mother waiting up for him. He tells her that he wants to get better, Oscar does. And she tells him that his father also called her that day, on the day that he died. Oscar tells her that he hopes she falls in love again and heads to his room. And I'm going to show you this, but I wasn't sure about showing you, but it's in the book. And I don't know if you know the image of the falling man, but it's here. So if you feel like that might be troublesome to you, please feel free to leave or close your eyes or tell me not to show it. But it is the very ending of the book. And it's a flip book. And this is how it goes. And he says, Oscar says to his mother, "Finally, I found the pictures of the falling body. Was it Dad? Maybe." Oh, Oscar has this book, this scrapbook called Stuff That's Happened to Me. It's very odd. And the photos here are, out of the book. So I ripped the pages out of the book, he says. I reversed the order so that the last one was first and the first one was last. When I flipped through them, it looked like the man was floating up through the sky. If I'd had more pictures, he would have flown through a window back into the building, and the smoke would have poured into the hole that the plane was about to come out of. Dad would have left his messages backwards until the machine was empty, and the plane would have flown backward away from him all the way to Boston. He would have taken the elevator to the street and pressed the button for the top floor. He would have walked backward to the subway, and the subway would have gone backward through the tunnel back to our stop. Dad would have gone backward through the turnstile, then swiped his Metro card backward, then walked home backward as he read the New York Times from right to left. He would have spit coffee into his mug, unbrushed his teeth, and put hair on his face with a razor. He would have gotten back into bed. The alarm would have rung backward. He would have dreamt backward. Then he would have gotten up again at the end of the night before the worst day. Oscar always calls it the worst day. He would have walked backward to my room, whistling "I Am the Walrus" backwards. How could you tell? He would have gotten into bed with me. He would have looked at the stars on my ceiling, which would have pulled back their light from our eyes. I'd have said nothing, backward. He'd have said, "Yeah, buddy," backward. I'd have said, "Dad," backward, which would have sounded the same as "Dad" forward. He would have told me the story of the sixth borough, from the voice in the can at the beginning, at the end to the beginning, from "I love you" to "once upon a time." We would have been safe. What are the ways to wisdom in this book? Oh my gosh, so many. You may have heard me say before a quote from a Yale literary critic named J. Hillis Miller. All storytelling is constructed over loss. Ovid in Metamorphoses says the same thing. Art makes up what fortune has denied. Art makes up what fortune has denied. Mario Vargas Llosa, in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, said fiction writers write to change the world. The loss that we experience, the losses that we experience, especially traumatic loss, especially national loss, cannot be recovered. We don't get to go backwards like that. The loss, the victims of the loss beyond the people and the infrastructure is also language. The loss shatters our language. And these shattered fragments, these words that no longer fit together, reflect our loss, but in a fragmentary way, because that's all they are, is fragments. We can just see glimpses of what was lost, but we can't put it back together. In seeing ourselves in these fragments, which is all we have, there's nothing new. There's no new story. There are only the ruins. But in the seeing ourselves fragmented, we begin to grieve. Upon beginning to grieve, a new story begins. Narratives are medicine, and we get better. Thank you.